I'm Rich Hanks, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to have Richard Hanks on the show. He's the author of his father's biography, To Be a Friend of Christ, The Life of Marion D. Hanks. And guess what? I'm going to be giving away a free autographed copy of this book right here to one of you. So go to gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win this book right here. In our next conversation with Richard, we're going to meet him and learn a little bit more about Marion's life. Marion actually grew up without a father, so we'll learn why that was. And also his calling as a general authority at just the age of 31. One time, the 70s quorum was a lot smaller than it is today. There was only one, not 12, and he was one of the only seven 70s. So it's going to be a very interesting conversation. You won't want to miss this. Check it out. Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm excited to have an amazing author about his amazing dad. So could you go ahead and tell us who you are and tell us about the book you wrote?
Sure. My name's Rich Hanks. I am the son of Marion D. Hanks. Here's the book. This came out, I guess it's been about 6 months now. Dad was a general authority of Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for just under 40 years.
Okay. Now tell us the name for some people who aren't watching.
The book is called To Be a Friend of Christ, The Life of Marion D. Hanks.
And Marion D. Hanks was your father.
And Marion D. Hanks was my dad, yeah.
Yeah. So very cool. So let's get a little bit about your background. I understand you taught at Columbia. Cornell, sorry. It began with a C.
That's right. Yeah,
so that's like an Ivy League school, right?
I guess.
So give us a little bit about your educational background.
Grew up here in Salt Lake. Saw this beautiful girl when I was a sophomore at East High School, walking by and said, wow, we have 11 grandkids. She was kind enough to marry me and stay with me. That's how I view it. Let's see. Grew up here, went to BYU, graduated in accounting, and went to be a CPA. Worked at the Jazz, where I know you spend some time, and other companies, Mrs. Fields Cookies, the Boy Scouts. I was just a basically beginning auditor. I did that for a couple of years, and I decided I didn't really want to be an auditor anymore. So I went to Northwestern, which is, in Chicago, and got my MBA. And then Liz and I, we went from Chicago. We had our first child born there, and then we went down to Dallas for a couple of years for Frito-Lay, PepsiCo. I worked for PepsiCo.
Okay.
We had a couple of kids born in Plano, Texas.
Okay.
Which when I was there was a smaller little town, and now has just exploded in growth.
Is that oil money or something else?
I don't know what it is. People love moving to Dallas, I guess. I mean, I thought our daughter, Emily, was going to have this accent, this Southern accent, and ends up that everybody there is from the East Coast or the West Coast. Anyway. Then I took a job at Marriott. We moved to Washington, and we really raised our kids there in Maryland, suburban Maryland, for the next, 13, 14 years. And I was at Marriott, started as a mid-level manager and ended up being a corporate officer. And then we decided to move home.
Did you meet Bill Marriott?
I worked for Bill Marriott as my boss. Yeah,
okay.
6 years. Off and on. There are 3 Bills that ran Marriott at the time, by the way, and all 3 Bills were at different times my
interesting.
My boss, yeah. It's actually one of the reasons I left. There were, at the time I was there were 4 presidents with a title. And I thought, you know what? I don't have the right last name. I'm not going to be... And I was an EVP, and so we just rolled the dice, and we moved home to Salt Lake, and where I became the CEO of a startup company, which failed miserably at 9/11.
Oh no!
Yeah, and then we started another one, and that one was successful, and we stayed there till my wife and I were called as mission presidents in Alabama, and I got a new word for that last week. It's or 2 weeks ago. I was voluntold. By a guy named President Uchtdorf said, you're going to go to Alabama for 3 years. And I was not planning on doing that. Anyway, we had a wonderful time in Alabama. And then I retired and started writing this book and doing some other writing and so forth. So along the way, I've taught a lot of universities, lots of public speaking. and had a lot of fun. I taught at Cornell for 10 summers in a row, a class I authored, and we've had a wonderful time. We have 3 kids. They all live in Utah. We never thought they would because they all grew up on the East Coast for their younger years. And we thought, well, but they've all moved back. I guess their mother is a big draw.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, I started writing this book about 3.5 years ago now, and I always wanted to be able to document my father's life, which we'll get into, but was really different. He was a unique individual.
Yeah. Well, very good. So if you look at the book, you can see it's a pretty thick book. This is only half of what you wrote, apparently.
Right. Yeah, I wrote the original. The original, I wouldn't call it the original manuscript because you're cutting and choosing all along the way, but it was 1,200 pages, and it ended up 600 pages. So you can tell there's a lot of stuff. I guess 600 pages is a more adequate number for publishers. So it ended up at 600. It's still a long book, but this was a man who lived a very comprehensive Renaissance man type life. And so people ask me all the time, well, what was in the hidden parts of the book of
Yeah, exactly.
Marion Hanks? Well, it's just I cut every part of his life back a little bit. Mostly, there's a few choice things that I pulled out, but yeah, it's been a real sweet experience for me to spend time getting to know him even better.
And it was funny to me because I knew you were the author, and then you talked about, well, Rich did this with Marion.
Yeah.
Was it weird saying
No.
not I and Dad?
Yeah, that's a publisher thing. Yeah. I learned a lot about writing books in the last 3.5 years. Yeah, I'm not a professional historian, look. And when I originally wrote it, it was Dad did this and Dad did that. And they cleaned it up and turned it into Rich. And I'm like, why am I talking about myself in the third person? And they said, because that's how biographies are written. And by the way, that is how biographies are written. I didn't know that at the time, but yeah, that's some of the editorial process that they went through. And I actually finished the books probably almost 2 years ago now, but it's been a year just in the process, in the line coming out. And they've helped the publishers were great. Signature, they did a wonderful job. And I had individual editors who helped make it much better. Like I said, I'm not a historian. I don't pretend to be one. Frankly, I'm a starry-eyed son. Although having said that, if you read the preface carefully, you'll see that I made a pretty strong effort to be objective. I mean, my dad had warts, so I put a few of the warts in the book, and I did my best to make it. But no matter what you do, I'm still his son, and it's still going to be leaning, towards. Actually, in the front of all of his Book of Mormon. So when I say Books of Mormon, and when I say that, he would do a new Book of Mormon every year.
Oh, wow.
Start marking, fresh copy, and then give it away. But in the front of most of them, he wrote these words by Goethe that are, I can promise to be sincere, but I can't promise to be impartial.
Mm-hmm.
Because he believed in the Book of Mormon. Well, I feel the same way, and I wrote that in the preface. I can promise to be sincere about him, but I'm sure that there are people who are going to have different opinions on some of the stories in here, or that haven't come to light, but there's been no obvious intent on my part to do that.
So let's jump into his life. It was interesting for me to find out that your dad, well, I think as members of the church, we know him as Marion D. Hanks, but he went by Duff, and the D stands for Duff. Mm-hmm. So, and also he grew up without a father.
True.
So tell us about that.
Sure. Grew up in Capitol Hill section of Salt Lake. They would call it the West Side. In those days, it was poor.
So you went to East High School, he went to East, West. Yeah, you guys were rivals.
Yeah, I also went to BYU, and he went to the University of Utah. So, yeah, I have a great story. I'll probably forget to tell it later, so I'll tell it now if that's okay. Yeah,
we go on tangents here.
Yeah. So one year where to begin? One year I'm sitting next to Jeff Holland, who's the president of BYU, and I'm in the next seat up in the press box, and there's Marion D. Hanks, Dad, and we're playing the University of Utah. And Dad stands and sings the University of Utah fight song.
Nice.
Sitting next to his...
A man after my heart.
Yeah, sitting next to his missionary, Jeff Holland. The next year, the games in Salt Lake, we're sitting next to Chase Peterson, the president of the University of Utah. Dad stands and sings the BYU Cougar fight song, which says more about him than anything. You know, he's on the board of trustees of BYU, but he graduated from the U and he graduated from West, and he spoke at West High School reunions, and I went to East, and so yeah, there was a lot of that going on. Grew up there. When he was 6, he was 60. That's not a quote I made up. I've heard that over and over again. Somehow he came the way he was. I don't know why or how, but gosh, the story is long, so I'll try to cut it down to the parts that might be most interesting to your listeners. He went on a mission. Then he came back and went to the war. Wanted to quit.
Tell me, let's back up.
Go ahead.
Because you said, he grew up without a father, so his dad died when he was really young.
Okay, I'll get to that. So, quick thing. In the 1860s, 2 couples, they come over from Liverpool. One of them's name is Helen Duff. She marries her friend's brother, David Dick, so she becomes Helen Duff Dick. They come to Zion. An old lady on the docks is supposed to have yelled, "You're going to drown, you horrible Mormons." And then they came across the plains, mostly by train, because it was a little later. And then Helen Duff would be my great-great-grandmother. Helen Duff was where he got his name. So Marion was named after Francis Marion Lyman, his grandfather.
Oh.
And then the Duff part came from Helen Duff. And then he's Marion Duff. I'm Richard Duff. My son is Daniel Duff. His son is James Duff. And we also have a Mark Duff. And so, that's a sweet thing in our family. We'll go down the line. Grows up, plays basketball at West High. He's the editor of the magazine there. And like I said earlier, everything he did, he was the best at. It's unbelievable. His athleticism was crazy.
A man after my heart, I can tell.
Played University of Utah basketball, quit to play in the all-church tournament with his brother.
Yeah, that's weird.
Can you imagine that today? one of the stars of, say, BYU, Utah, whatever, Duke, Kentucky, quitting to go play in a church tournament. There's a great story in the book about that. I won't tell you.
No, you should. I'm a basketball fan. We can talk about this.
Well, the big famous coach at the U was Vadel Peterson, and Vadel Peterson went on to win both the NIT and the NCAA tournaments. And Dad had to go in and tell him, I'm going to go on a mission, and then later, I'm going to go play with my brother Bruce in the all-church tournament. People don't know about the all-church. The all-church tournament was immense, huge. And probably the biggest tournament of basketball in the world at the time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, an interesting story.
I think we should bring it back.
Yeah, you should read the book. We won't have time for all these stories, but they get to the finals, and Oakland, one of the Oakland wards, is playing in the finals. This is in Salt Lake City, and Dad's team is full of returned missionaries and returned military guys from the war,
and college guys apparently,
yeah, and They beat in the semifinals. The Oakland beat in the semifinals. They're preparing to play the game. It's like a half an hour to the game starts. And in walks the first presidency, or the young men's presidency of the church. And the short version of it is, they say to this team, the other team from Oakland has like 1 or 2 members. All the rest are ringers, so that they could come in and beat the Mormons. And they were all drunk last night at the Hotel Utah to celebrate their last win. So we have all these people here to watch. Can you beat them? Because if you can't, we're going to have to forfeit and send everybody home. We'd rather not do that. Isn't that a great story? So they just destroy them. I mean, they beat them. I can't remember the numbers, but it was just off the charts. Dad goes on a mission, loves his mission, has 2 great mission presidents he adored. Near the end of his mission, he wants to quit because Pearl Harbor has happened.
Right.
My mother at the time, my dad didn't know her. She's over in Honolulu watching the Japanese Zero airplanes come over. She actually watched the attack.
Oh, wow.
But anyway, Dad wanted to do his patriotic duty, and ends up something like 600,000 men in the United States signed up to get in the military the week after Pearl Harbor. And it makes you wonder, would anybody, how would that go today? I don't know. Goes to the war. He's on a submarine chaser. Goes to Honolulu. They have R&R in Pearl Harbor while their ship is being redone, resupplied and everything. He goes to the Waikiki Ward, which is now called the Makiki Ward, stands up, bears his testimony, and my mom goes, wow, dressed white and everything. So we're all here.
So he's dressed in his Navy uniform.
Yeah, and they fall in love, and there's a whole long story there. And she follows him to the University of Utah. She graduates. He hasn't asked her to marry him yet. Dad. Some commitment problems. We don't know. He blames it on taking care of his widowed mother, but I'm going to come back to that in a minute.
Okay.
They get married, and then that's where they begin their life in Salt Lake. When he's newly young, I guess a baby, his dad gets appendicitis. It bursts, and my grandfather died, and so Dad never had a dad. He was 2 years old.
Wow.
And his widowed mother raised these 7 kids. 6 lived. 1 other died, and he paid homage to her his whole life. She was incredible. I mean, she was a Ward Relief Society president, Stake Relief Society president, political activist in her neighborhood. They had no money. And Dad, there's this great story in the book where Dad says, my grandma Maud says to him, go get a loaf of bread down at the store for us. And he said, there's 7 loaves of bread you just baked on the kitchen table. And she said, well, that's for the poor people. And he said, huh? Aren't we? I mean, I thought we were the poor. But anyway, that's how he grew up. And she was a saint. And so my mom and dad are in Salt Lake, and he graduates from law school, but doesn't want to be an attorney. So he teaches seminary at West High. And then he becomes a principal of the seminary, and then he gets hired as a guide on Temple Square. In those days, they had people in the valley were the guides on Temple Square, including, by the way, he served as a guide with Russell Nelson, Neil Maxwell. But Dad was the boss, so he hired all this.
He hired President Nelson.
President Nelson. He hired President Nelson to be a guide on Temple Square, and Neil Maxwell.
Wow.
So he becomes the assistant director of Temple Square, and the director is Richard L. Evans, who is a 70. Now, need to do a quick tangent here.
Yes, I want to spend some time on the 70s.
People forget. This may be the most controversial thing you're going to hear me say today. People forget, or they never knew, what the general authorities were like 100 years ago, or even in this case, in the 1950s, right? So 75 years ago. This focus on the 12 apostles, honestly, wasn't anywhere near like it is today. And presentism, which is the taking of today's experiencing and trying to understand the history, doesn't really put this into a correct time, or a correct, I wouldn't say time frame, but it's not a time frame. It doesn't put it into the correct era. There were 33 general authorities when my dad was called. Today there must be, I don't even know, 500 or something. If you include all the area authorities, there must be more than that. And the 12 were not specific, like we have to hear what the apostles and the first president. It was all of them. I'm not saying that to make my dad look better. I'm saying that because it'll come up that over and over again, his voice was louder than many others in their temple meeting. Every Thursday, the general authorities all met together. Later, there were special meetings for the 12. And today, we place this huge pedestal for the 12 in the first presidency, which is fine, but it wasn't like that back then. So Richard L. Evans is a 70, one of the 7 presidents.
And there were only 7 70s.
7 70s. Today we would call that the presidency of the 70. Then it was
Why did we have only 7 when they're supposed to be 7?
Because they were in the stakes.
Okay.
So there were 70. You would be an elder, and then a 70, and then a high priest.
Yeah.
And the 70s were all in the stakes. And so these 7 presidents ran all these 70s all over the world. But back then there was only a couple million members, right? So As another tangent on a tangent, Dad looked at that and said, "What in the world are we doing? This is not what the Doctrine and Covenants says." So we'll come back. We can come back to that. For those of you who are into administration of the church, we ended up with regional representatives and assistants to the 12, and none of this is scriptural, which he pointed out over and over again. And then finally, somebody listened. Spencer Kimball listened, actually, or maybe God told him. I'm not trying to take credit. I'm just pointing out historical fact. But here's the interesting story about when he was called. So he's 31 years old. He's never been an elders quorum president. He's never been a bishop. He's not sat in these, this ladder of chairs that they sit in now usually. And he gets a call. Well, let me back up a little bit. In those days, General Conference was Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So Friday, there were 6 sessions, or 7, I guess, if you include priesthood. So on Friday morning, he is asked to give the opening prayer as the assistant director of Temple Square, a job. I mean, he was paid to do it. And Richard L. Evans, who was the music and the spoken word for 40 years, I think, or some large.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Richard L. Evans was the president and also a general authority. He gets a call, and it's 7:30 in the morning on Sunday now. He prays on Friday. It's Sunday morning, 7:30, call. Hello, this is David O. McKay, the prophet. Sure it is. I worked for Bill Marriott for a long time, and I'd have to be with him on these calls we'd sometimes make into hotels. Everyone does this. Sure it is. Bob, is this you? So he often talks about that experience and said, I'm lucky I didn't say sure it is. And David O. McKay said, this is the President McKay. I'd like you to come to my office right now. So at 31 years old, he goes down to President McKay's office, and President McKay says, we have called Richard L. Evans to be an apostle. We'd like you to take his place in the first quorum, the first council of the 70.
Right.
There's a sweet experience there. We don't have time, but it's really touching because Dad knew in advance. They didn't ever talk about it much, but I found it in some journal entries that were kind of discreet, not hidden, but he didn't make a big deal about it. But he had written, I knew what was going to happen.
Huh.
My mom, on the other hand, gets this call from my dad, from the no cell phones, right? So calls from the Hotel Utah and says, you need to come down at the 10 o'clock session of conference. I've been called to take Richard L. Evans' place.
Well, he just told her to come. He didn't.
He said, I've been called to take Richard L. Evans' place. Yeah.
I thought.
And
okay.
she thought, actually, I wonder if I have this nearby. I probably don't. It's better to read. Oh yeah, here you go. So this is in the book. I'd rather quote my mom than, it was Sunday morning. I had the flu. This is my mom. Duff called me to say he'd been in to see President McKay and he'd been called to take Richard L. Evans' place. I thought that he'd been called as the director of Temple Square. And I said, well, that's nice, honey. He said, I really think you ought to come down to conference. This was at 8:30 and conference started at 10. And I thought, why on earth does he want me to go to a conference just because he's been called to take Richard L. Evans' place on Temple Square? So I've done.
And he was called to take his place on Temple Square, right?
But he was
also called to the 70.
So now, no, Richard L. Evans stayed, I think.
He did?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So they ran Temple Square together, 2 general authorities, very different than today, right?
Well, they do run Temple Square. You never see them.
Yeah, they have a Temple Square mission president, and now they have sisters, right? The young sisters, which is a great thing. I think it's a good improvement, maybe. So he loved Temple Square for the rest of his life. He just loved everything about it. So it's usually at this time in these podcasts, I've done a number of these podcasts. I like to stop because I really think presentism has us in a situation where we don't understand what that meant. So this is just a little bit of background for people. And the way I like to explain that is there are two sets of words that everyone who works in the world comes to love. Weekend, on the weekend, I don't have to work. I'm going to be, and retirement. Both of those are gone the moment you're called as a general authority in 1953.
There are no weekends.
There are no weekends for the rest of your life.
Wow.
You might get 1 or 2 here and there, but in general. And there is no retirement. You retire when you die. So let me put that in context. We're very close to Elder Holland, President Holland. His retirement is when he dies. And every weekend, now he's older now, but particularly when they're young, my dad's out 45 to 50 weekends a year.
Wow.
That means my mom's driving him to the Salt Lake airport. He's getting on a Western Airlines, now Delta, flight that has not figured out that smoking kills you yet. And he's flying to Poughkeepsie or Boca Raton or Tennessee or Florida or South Dakota. And he's at a state conference all day Saturday and Sunday. So when you have your state conference, that general authority got on a plane or drove, if he's nearby now, for the rest of his life. And he did that for 40 years.
Wow.
And so I don't think people really understand. And I really don't like it when the ex-Mormons and anti-Mormons talk about all the money they make and what a great life. And they have no clue. There is no one who would choose this that I know of. I've never met anyone who'd say, "Oh yeah, that's the life I want." By the way, they didn't pay him squat. They pay him a little bit more now, but we didn't have any money. Mm-hmm. We weren't poor, but he was working 2 jobs. All general authorities, since they don't get Saturday and Sunday, they take Monday off. And he worked to edit the New Era. It was called
Monday.
The Improvement Era was a section in the New Era for kids, for high school-ish type kids. And he and Elaine Cannon edited that for 10 or 20 years. I don't remember. But that's how he made a little extra money, because they weren't paying him anything in his stipend. And the reason they weren't paying him is because all the general authorities were in their 60s and 70s. And had all been on successful people in business and boards. And he said, I'm driving around, Sterling Still's driving a Cadillac, and I'm barely able to put gas in my car.
And this is at age, because you said
he's 31.
31, yeah.
Well, and usually at this point, I have to stop and say to people, listen, think of a son that's 31.
Yeah.
Or think of when you were 31. I mean, he was young. Yeah. And my mom was 27 and had 2 little kids. And so anyway, he spent the next 40 years on
so
every
to make
weekend.
His money, he's working at Temple Square, making a probably pretty small salary.
Yeah.
He's filling that in by working on Mondays at the New Era.
Right. And he's given his stipend. They make a little bit, right?
Yeah.
And people make a big deal about that. And it just cracks me up, because he got all these offers over the next 40 years to be CEO of this company, CEO of that company, president of the university. One day I'm sitting, we're kind of on a tangent. I guess that's okay. Well, that's the name of the thing.
Exactly.
We're on, I'm in his kitchen. I'm watching TV. And I said, hey, Dad, you're on TV, which is not an unusual thing. He's on TV all the time. But what am I doing? And so I said, well, you're on KSL. Hey, you're running for senator. And he said, I am? And then this is a true story. And the phone rings about 10 minutes later. Hello. This is Orrin Hatch. And for those who don't know, Orrin Hatch ended up being our Utah senator for, I don't know,
40 years.
40 years.
Yeah. It's a long time.
He calls up and he says, is Marion Hanks there? And I said, yeah, let me go get him. And then I can hear my dad and Orrin Hatch is saying, if you're going to run, I'm not running.
Oh, wow.
So that's when he ran for the first time.
Oh, wow. That was 76, I think.
Somewhere. I was 16, so I was still at home. Yeah. The point of all of that is that all of them could quadruple their salaries, their stipend immediately by leaving church. There's nobody getting rich from this. And so that's the life that my mother saw looming, from a normal life to complete and 100% commitment at 31 years old and 2 little kids.
So I'm curious because he taught seminary for a time, and then he taught at the Institute at the University of Utah. How does that fit into his career?
Well, so he went to the U, and he loved Lowell Bennion. And I don't know if your readers know or listeners know who Lowell Bennion was, but just one of the all-time greatest human beings that's ever lived.
I've read a biography on Lowell Bennion, but I haven't got the author on yet.
Oh, just unbelievable human being. Lowell was at the Institute, and Dad fell in love with Lowell. Lowell spoke at his missionary farewell.
Oh, wow.
How's that? So then Dad comes home and does all these things, and then he gets asked by Lowell to go up and teach at the Institute at the U. So he teaches at the Institute at the U for 20 years as a general authority.
Oh, wow.
More nights away from home. You know, this is during the week, and he's teaching, and
So he was a little bit of a workaholic, it sounds like.
he didn't know how to say no. He really didn't. He said yes to the Aaronic priesthood dinner in Davis County, and he just said yes to everything, which was tough, And I imagine under psychotherapy, some psychiatrists would tell me that there's problems in my life because of that. But I knew when he was with me, he loved us, my sisters and I. But he was just gone. That's why I pay such homage to my mom in the book, because she really raises. Can you imagine every Friday night going down to the airport to pick up your husband? And then she'd take his suit and hang it up and air it out and get the cigarette smoke off. And then, and then the next day, a day off for one day, and then back to the office at 8 a.m. and then counseling. The other thing is just counseling thousands of people. And we have no record of that because they're all confidential.
Right.
But if you look at his time commitment, it would be counseling probably is the biggest amount of his time. And then, one-on-one with human beings. And if I had a lot of choices on what to name this book, I wrote To Be a Friend of Christ because Christ was his life. But I could have called it Focusing on the One, or Ministering to the One, because the One was where he spent his time, and on the Savior. So he gets called as this general authority, and then basically he's in for the next 40 years. I should say sometimes he would take us with him.
Mm-hmm.
I learned how to drive a clutch in Parowan. In between, he's in a Saturday afternoon interviewing for the new state presidency, and I'm out destroying his clutch. In fact, he came out and he said, "You smell that, Rich?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I do." And he said, "That's called a clutch. Maybe we need to practice this again." So funny. I don't know if anybody knows who a clutch is.
Yeah, everybody has an automatic now.
Anyway.
I grew up with a stick and a clutch, so I know what you're talking about.
In those days, yeah, So he would take, if it was nearby and he was going to drive, he would say, "Rich, why don't you come with me?" And that was always a treat, to be able to go with Dad. But I had to sit through a lot of church meetings. So that was the downside. But there were at least him speaking. So
right. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Richard Hanks. He's the biographer of his father, Marion D. Hanks, To Be a Friend of Christ. I'm going to be giving away a free copy of this. Go to gospeltangents.com/contest. You could win this autographed copy right here. In our next conversation, we're going to talk about the baseball baptisms in England. I was surprised to find out that Marion Hanks was the guy tasked with cleaning up that problem.
And what had happened was, in the previous 2 or 3 years, Henry D. Moyle, who was in the first presidency, had been, my words, whipping the horses, go team go, let's see some numbers out of this. And they'd just gotten out of control. And they were baptizing. This is all documented elsewhere, but I'll just give the most horrendous thing. Well, they were baptizing children into the MIA club. So you get your MIA club membership, and then
Mutual Improvement
Association, which is young men, young women's. Mm-hmm. This is the 1960s, right? You're gonna join our club, but we're all gonna go swimming. And then they'd baptize 15 kids without telling their parents or without the kids knowing anything. They thought no
discussions, no nothing.
And that's why it became known as baseball baptisms, because it could have been known as swimming baptisms, but it was also baseball. They would say, "We're Americans, so let's come play baseball, and then afterwards we're all going to go swimming." These are not a good time for the history of the church. So Dad gets there, and immediately the baptisms fall 95%.
Thanks for listening, and I hope you to continue to enjoy Gospel Tangents. Consider becoming a Patreon, or go to gospeltangents.com/shop, and you can get a cool tie, a hat, or even a nice mug. You can also get a sweatshirt. So check it out at gospeltangents.com/shop.